Welcome to a new episode of We Are Around the World. Every day there's a new episode. Don't forget to support us by subscribing to the channel and, liking and admiring. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 15 men from Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, 1 from Lebanon, and 1 from Egypt, hijacked 4 aircraft from 3 different airports along the United States East Coast. 2 of them were then flown into the World Trade Center buildings in New York, 1 of them flew into the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C., while the 4th crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. In total, 2,996 people died that day, and the world was changed forever in just under 2.5 hours. The U.S. government blamed the terrorist group Al-Qaeda for the attack, and their leader, Osama bin Laden, for recruiting and bankrolling the hijackers. That is the official story, but over the years, people have questioned this narrative. These so-called truthers believe that the US government not only knew about the attacks, but perhaps even orchestrated them themselves, and they claim to know how and why they did it. So, who really was behind 9/11? Within the truthers movement there are a lot of different theories, so we're going to cover just a few of the main ones that have been hotly debated over the years. Firstly, truthers say the US government used controlled thermite explosions to bring down the towers. The burning jet fuel that supposedly melted the steel beams burns between 426 and 855 degrees. That's a lot cooler than the 1,510 degrees needed to melt the Twin Towers' steel supports. They say only thermite is hot enough to do that. Also, they point out the puffs of air that were seen as the towers collapsed, and say that's proof of a controlled explosion happening on certain floors just below the collapsing building. Well, those on the other side have answers for that too. They say for thermite to melt through a vertical steel beam, it would need special high-temperature containment to stop the molten iron from just dripping off and doing no more damage. Now, they admit the burning jet fuel also wasn't hot enough to melt the building's steel beams, but they were hot enough to weaken them. That's the crucial thing. Add to that tons of combustible materials that were in the office building, and the beams were weak enough to collapse. The floors below could simply no longer support the weight from above, and those puffs of air were not from controlled explosions, but rather from the crashing floors expelling air as they fell. Each floor of the Twin Towers was about 1/4 mile in size, and all that air had to be released somehow. Okay, but why then did World Trade Center Building 7 collapse 7 hours after the Twin Towers fell? This totally separate 47-story building came down. It was nearby but had not been hit by a plane, and somehow still managed to collapse into its own footprint 7 hours later. Again, the truthers believe thermite was to blame. They say that at one point, it looked as if the building was in free fall as it came down, which shouldn't be possible, as the building's support should have resisted and slowed down the collapse. So how could this have happened unless it was through controlled demolition? Well, the official story is that, yes, World Trade Center Building 7 was not hit by a plane, but it was hit by a 110-story skyscraper as it collapsed, one of the Twin Towers. This sparked severe fires for hours in the building that weakened a critical support column inside. The fires were very fierce and went unchecked by firefighters for hours and hours, eventually weakening more and more exterior metal beams until the floors began to cave in, causing the collapse. But still, why were they in free fall for those seconds? Well, it actually happened in 3 stages. The first stage, the building began to buckle and only fell a few feet because the columns were starting to break. Then, with no columns to hold up those floors, they began to free fall for 8 stories. Eventually though, they did slow to below freefall speed as they collapsed into non-buckled structures at the bottom of the building. Other truthers then ask, why did the Air Force not take down the planes beforehand? The government's NORAD system should have issued a stand-down order to the planes as soon as they, of course, if they failed to respond, they should have surely been shot down. Well, NORAD didn't actually track commercial planes before 9/11. That was the job of the nation's air traffic control teams. Unfortunately, the hijackers had ripped off the transponders on the planes, which, made it really difficult to locate them. By the time air traffic control had alerted NORAD of the missing planes and fighter jets had been scrambled, one of the planes had already hit the towers, and the fighters got nowhere near the rest of them. But regardless of what stance you take, whether you think that planes and jet fuel brought the towers down, or that it was a government-staged attack with a controlled thermite explosion, the question still remains, why? So, why would a government supposedly kill almost 3,000 people and then, blame it on a terrorist group? Well, truthers claim it was used by the US government to justify things like the Patriot Act. Now this came into effect 13 days after the attack, and was aimed at strengthening security and the power of law enforcement agencies. But truthers have claimed that it didn't really do that. Instead, it was used to take away people's personal freedom and give the government more power to control the population. They also think it was what's known as a false flag attack. After 9/11, the US government had popular support to go to war in the Middle East, and pretty much do what they wanted to do. They say this involved taking out those who opposed them and getting their hands on oil, and anyone who objected to any of this was deemed un-American. Now, while there are, many issues with the legitimacy and conduct of the wars that happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, would the US government have killed their own to justify them happening? That is the question. Since the 9/11 attacks, there have been countless Al-Qaeda operatives out there who have claimed responsibility for the attack. Even Osama bin Laden himself on a number of occasions. Many people believe that the government would not only have been crazy to do this, but that the information almost certainly would have leaked out somehow. Could a country that has seen so many political leaks in its history be able to suppress the most insane, devastating, and hardest to contain information of all time? There are still people to this day on both sides of the fence about whether the US government would actually do this to itself to justify the wars and give itself increased powers. So, was the government lying? Were they capable of this both morally and technically? Does the evidence sway you one way or the other? Years on, it's still a hotly debated question because, well, it makes people question their own trust in governments, in scientists, in history, and even themselves. For now though, the conventional story that 19 terrorists committed an unspeakable act of horror on that day is still the leading explanation. What do you guys think? Leave your thoughts down below in the comment section. I'm Danny Berg, and this has been Life's Biggest Questions. Make sure you subscribe for more videos, and we'll see you all in the next one.